Good morning everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Apprenticeships, 20% off the job and best practice. My name is Michelle, I'm the Events Executive at the City and Guilds Group. Joining me in the room today is Ronnie, Funding and Policy Lead for City and Guilds. Before I hand over to Brian, I just want to run through some housekeeping details with you. All of you are on listen only mode. However, please do send through any questions you have using the chat facility on the right hand side of your screen. We do expect it to be popular, so we will hold all questions to the end. We will also send a copy of the slides and the recording out to you after the webinar, so don't worry, you will get a copy of everything. We will also have a feedback survey at the end of the webinar, which asks some feedback on what sort of things you'd like to see going forward. So please do take a few moments to fill that out. So I'm just going to hand over to you now, Bryony.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Can we just check sound, everybody, and make sure that you can hear us? If someone could just type into their into the questions or notes section to make sure that you can actually hear us, that would be great. Also joining me today is Dr. John Lanham, a colleague of ours who is ex-University West of England. Till last year, John was the Assistant Vice Chancellor and specialised in apprenticeships at University of Western England. And John will be covering some best practice in 20% off the job later on. But first of all, we will go through the funding and policy of off the job. That's the first bit, the funding rules and the compliance areas that you have to be aware of as providers to make sure that you are complying with the audit requirements that the Education and Skills Funding Agency or ESFA expect as part of their audit requirements for off the job. We'll talk a little bit about some of the best practice to do with recording and evidencing off the job, and then John will cover his best practice section, and finally at the end we'll have a period of time for questions from everybody. So without further ado, off the job training. One of the key tenets of the off the job that the Skills Funding Agency, Education and Skills Funding Agency and Department for Education say must be met is the fact that it must teach new knowledge, new skills and new behaviours. So any off the job training that occurs has to cover new skills and new knowledge. Sorry, excuse me everybody a moment. This is particularly important with off the job because it is something that's audited. The other aspect of off the job is that it must match the apprenticeship standard or the apprenticeship framework that you're delivering. So if as the content of your off the job you must make sure that it's actually covered in the apprenticeship standard and the apprenticeship framework that you're delivering. So if, for example, you are working with an employer that requires you or wants to have a non-mandatory qualification included in the delivery of the apprenticeship, you cannot use the content of that non-mandatory qualification to contribute towards off the job unless the content of that qualification maps to the standard or framework. So the other aspects of off the job training, which can be complex and quite challenging, are how you calculate off the job. And I do have a slide later on taking you through a couple of different calculations. So when it says statutory holiday entitlement must be deducted for off the job hours, that statutory entitlement is the national statutory holiday entitlement. Now that means it's 28 days because the national statutory holiday entitlement is 4 weeks holiday or 20 days plus the 8 days bank holiday that everybody has. So it doesn't matter what your employer is offering that you're working with in terms of holiday pay or holiday time. What you as providers or employer providers must deduct is the statutory holiday entitlement. That's the national entitlement. You have to make sure that off the job training takes place during paid hours only. Now there are some interesting scenarios with that because we have in the past had conversations with the ESFA where we've discussed paid hours because there have been off the job training or learning that takes place outside of paid hours that could contribute to off the job that both the provider and the employer and the apprentice have felt is important. So what the ESFA have said that is off the job training must take place during paid hours, but if off the job training takes place or something that can contribute to off the job training takes place outside of paid hours, as long as the apprentice is given time off in lieu, that can count. But you as employers or employer providers must make sure that you are evidencing that. Now by paid hours, the ESFA mean the apprentice's normal contracting hours. So that would be what is written into their employment contract with their employer. It doesn't include periods of irregular overtime, so something that might occur as part of an off-the-cuff project or something that just occurs out of the blue. But if regular overtime is included in the off-the-job if regular overtime is included as part of the apprentice's employment contract, that must be included in the off-the-job calculations. So, for example, if an apprentice worked one Saturday every month and that was part of their employment contract, that one Saturday every month as overtime, if it's paid as overtime, has to be included in your off-the-job calculations. So this does make for some interesting scenarios, and I have one employer that we spoke to at an event last year who had a batch of their apprentices that did actually work 2 Saturdays a month because of the type of job they did. And then they had another batch of apprentices that did a very similar job, so were on exactly the same qualification, but those apprentices didn't work any Saturdays because they were in a slightly different job role. So the apprentices that had to work 2 Saturdays a month, the employer and the provider had to calculate extra off the job time for those apprentices because of their regular overtime that occurred 2 Saturdays a month, even though they were doing the same apprenticeship as another batch of apprentices inside the same employer. So it can make for some interesting scenarios for you as providers and employer providers and employers to calculate. So just do be aware of that and have conversations with your employer about how best to work around it. And 20% off the job also needs to occur before the apprentice reaches gateway. That's the time when you and your employer have assessed that the apprentice has learned everything they need to learn as part of their apprenticeship, and they are now ready for assessment. All your off-the-job learning needs to take place before that time. It cannot take place after gateway. And from an evidence point of view, you must make sure that clear calculations of how you've calculated the off-the-job that the apprentice has to do is included in both the commitment statement and in your evidence pack that you keep for each individual apprentice. So make sure that your calculations are clear, and we'll go to that calculation slide later on so you can have a look and see how I've done that. Now, off the job, it's increasingly, I'm surprised by the conversations we have with employers who still think that off the job has to take place either via block release or day release only. Whereas in actual fact, there is a lot of training that occurs inside an employer that can contribute to the off the job time. So it's really worthwhile having a good, serious conversation with your employer before you start the apprenticeship about what training they actually include in their training of their apprentice, particularly if it's a new employee, and then work through that with them. And you can generally, during that conversation, find out that some of the work that the employer does in terms of training with their apprentice can contribute to the off-the-job time. So you can see here a selection of different exercises and different occurrences that could contribute to off-the-job. That includes obviously the teaching of theory and lectures, which has to take place with nearly all apprenticeships, but shadowing or being mentored, spending time on manufacturing training or new equipment technologies, visiting employers' other departments, industry visits or visiting other companies or suppliers. If the apprentice is learning that something that is relevant to the particular apprenticeship, that can also contribute to off the job. So as I say, having that conversation with your employer before the apprentice starts is really important to establishing what it is that they deliver that can also contribute to the off-the-job time, potentially lowering the amount of time that the apprentice may need to spend outside of their working place in a classroom or doing block release or day release. So these are some of the things that off-the-job training cannot include. It doesn't include enrolment or diagnostic assessment or any prior assessment, including prior assessment of prior learning. It doesn't include the English and Maths, which is funded separately, and also any time off the job for English and Maths has to be in addition to off the job training. It doesn't include things like progress reviews or on-programme assessment, and it doesn't include training only delivered as part of distance learning or online learning. You can include online and other blended learning activities as part of the apprenticeship, but it cannot be solely delivered by online learning. It doesn't include training that takes place outside of the apprentice's paid working hours, unless, as I said earlier, the employer is offering time off in lieu in place of that time that's that training that takes place outside the paid working hours. And non-mandatory qualification time spent off the job does also not contribute. So again, if your employer is asking for a non-mandatory qualification as part of that apprenticeship, and that non-mandatory qualification requires time spent out of the workplace as well, that time has to be in addition to off the job. It cannot count towards the off the job training for the apprenticeship, unless of course the non-mandatory qualification learning maps to the apprenticeship standard or framework. So I've done a couple of calculations for off the job to help providers understand how you might go around calculating this with that new statutory holiday arrangement, which only came in actually on the 1st of August last year. Prior to that, there was a slightly different arrangement for calculating off the job that wasn't as clear. So it's good that the Skills Funding Agency has made this clearer now. So example one is a very bog standard 8 hours a day, 5 days a week apprenticeship on a 1-year apprenticeship duration. So you would minus the statutory holiday time of 28 days or 5.6 weeks. So that's your calculation. You'd have 52 weeks a year. You would deduct the 5.6 weeks or 28 days, times it by the 40 hours, times it by 20%, and that gives you 371.2 hours off the job during that 1-year apprenticeship duration that you would have to deliver with that apprentice. Example two is a little bit more complex. You're looking at a 7.5-hour day times 5 days a week, but this particular apprentice, much like the employer that I spoke to last year, works 1 paid Saturday per month, and that is a 7.5-hour day on the Saturday. They're on a 2-year apprenticeship duration. So to do that calculation, you would minus the 2 weeks statutory holiday leave, that's 56 days or 11.2 weeks. So your calculation becomes 52 weeks times 2, which is 104 weeks, minus your statutory holiday, which leaves 92.8 weeks, times your 37.5 hours times 20%, that equals 696 hours. And then you would add on the 24 Saturdays, times that by 20%, and that's your 36 hours. So the total off the job over 2 years for that particular apprenticeship is 732 hours that you would have to deliver with that apprentice. I hope that's clear, but please feel free to ask me any questions about that towards the end. So recording, sorry about the background noise, everybody. Recording off the job training. There are various ways that you can record off the job training. It's a really good idea and very good practice to do this in conjunction with your apprentice and help them understand exactly what they should be recording in terms of off the job, because there may be times when you as a provider are not actually there, but the apprentice is still doing off the job training, and they need to understand what it is they can log of off the job training and how they can log that. So we have apprentices here inside City and Guilds. Some of them use an actual journal or logbook. They do that online, and some of them have it as a physical logbook. Some of them use their Outlook or their work calendar to log their off-the-job training. You can also use e-portfolio tracking systems, such as City and Guilds Learning Assistant has an off-the-job tracking system now embedded in that particular system that we've implemented recently. So that's a really good system for the apprentice to track their off the job, plus the employer, plus the provider can use that as well. There may be internal staff or apprentice intranet systems or platforms which they can use to track their off the job, or you may have other bespoke applications. And then you can review that off the job timing and the amount that's being delivered and the amount that's being attained during your one-to-ones and performance reviews with either line manager or with the tutor, so that not only is the apprentice tracking off the job, but the tutor is tracking it and the line manager is tracking it. That way you all know exactly how far along you are and how much has got to be delivered before the actual training end date of that particular apprenticeship. So there's a variety of different ways of doing that, but making sure the apprentice is engaged, understands off the job, understands how to track it and monitor it and how to log it, it becomes a much more efficient and effective way. And also when Ofsted come in, if they do actually have an interview with that apprentice and that apprentice understands how their off job occurred and how they were logging it, as far as Ofsted are concerned, that's a much better outcome as far as the apprentice is concerned for their learning aim and their learning outcome. And it's likely to give you a much better outcome on your Ofsted inspection as well. So evidencing off the job. So the fundamental objective of the apprenticeship plan, that's the plan that is put into place and agreed between the employer, the apprentice and the provider. A fundamental part of that apprenticeship plan and evidence pack is how the off-the-job time will be timetabled and delivered. That has to be agreed up front with the apprentice and the employer and logged with the explanation of how it will be achieved and also with that calculation that I mentioned earlier. As providers, you will need written confirmation from the employer allowing the apprentice to complete their programme, including written confirmation of the off-the-job. and that they agree that that time off will be given to enable the apprentice to achieve that. So the commitment statement, which is signed by both the apprentice, the employer and the provider, must detail those off-the-job arrangements, including that calculation. And Ofsted and QAA look at whether the off-the-job element is fulfilling the learning needs of the programme for the individual learner. They don't look at the off-the-job in terms of the time allowed for it. What they look at is whether the off-the-job fulfills the needs of that particular learner on that learning programme. Now, in some cases, Ofsted may make the assumption that actually more than 20% is required to enable that learner to complete their programme, and more than 20% off the job time is a requirement for that particular learner or that particular apprentice. So as providers and employers, it's really important that your calculations take that into consideration and that you really understand how much time is actually needed to ensure that that a particular individual apprentice is having their learning needs fulfilled and they can achieve their apprenticeship effectively and efficiently and successfully. So making that calculation isn't just about committing and meeting the 20%, it's about meeting the learning needs of the apprentice. And 20% off the job is the minimum that the ESFA expect. Ofsted or QAA may expect more. So a few top tips from the field. Planning in your day release or block release as a starting point at the commencement of the apprenticeship is a really important aspect of that planning. Basically, because if something goes wrong during the actual timeline of the apprenticeship and you've suddenly got less time to deliver it, maybe the apprentice goes off sick for a period of time and misses some of their, not long enough for it to be counted as a break, but long enough to miss some of their off-the-job training, you've then got a backlog to try and catch up later on. So planning it in at the beginning and making sure that you get as much as you off-the-job achieved in the early stages of the apprenticeship as you can, is a really good way of making sure that you don't come up against any blockers later on. And making contingency plans in case there are is also really important. From an Ofsted and QAA point of view, creating a bespoke offer which meets the needs of the employer and the apprentice is also really important. Yes, you've got an apprenticeship standard to deliver, but that standard is a fairly, it's basically, as we know, 2 pages, which states what you must deliver to ensure that at the end of the apprenticeship, the apprentice is completely qualified in terms of the knowledge, skills, competencies and behaviours that are required as part of that apprenticeship standard. So your offer is to a certain extent slightly flexible to meet the needs of that individual employer, as long as you deliver everything and at the end of it, that apprentice has all the skills, knowledge, competencies, behaviours stated in the standard. Timetabling everything is also incredibly important from the beginning, because that helps your employer and your apprentice commit to the actual apprenticeship so they know exactly what's expected of them, and it enables or stops any worries or concerns or conflicts later down the line of the apprenticeship if the employer understands right from the word go, and so does the apprentice. As I said earlier on, involving the apprentice both in understanding what it is they've got to have, what will be delivered to them, and what it is they've got to do in terms of logging their off the job, really helps you and your employer understand what's got to be done, and also is a big support when it comes to Ofsted or QAA inspections. And keeping it under review regularly during those reviews with your apprentice to make sure that you are hitting your off-the-job targets in terms of hours and time delivered is also an important aspect of it. There's a few other things to think of as well. So as a minimum, providers need to have recorded and agreed those following 3 points. The total apprenticeship duration, that's how long the apprentice is going to be. It's got to be the minimum of 12 months. And that's something to take into consideration when you consider prior learning. And I'll talk a bit more about this in a moment, because this has become increasingly important. And it's definitely something to look at the same time as you're establishing how much off the job needs to occur. So you've got to log total apprenticeship duration, and obviously with a learning end date as part of your ILR return. The contracted employment time, i.e. how many hours per week or per month does that apprentice do? And therefore, what is the 20% of that contracted employment time? And that amounts to your 20% off the job. Now, the reason I've raised recognition of prior learning is because that's been coming up the agenda recently as a key important audit point for the Education and Skills Funding Agency and the Department for Education. So, ESFA have recently advertised for a specialist organisation to take on board, audit and looking at the recognition of prior learning that employers and providers are looking at before the apprentice starts. Now, prior learning means any learning or any training or any on-the-job learning or any qualification that an apprentice may have that contributes to the knowledge as part of the apprenticeship that the apprentice is doing. So if, for an example, 3 or 4 years ago, an apprentice took a qualification, some of the qualification content replicated what was called for in the apprenticeship that the apprentice is about to do, as providers, you need to deduct that amount of learning off the time and learning involved in the apprenticeship that the apprentice is about to do. So you would have to reduce the duration of the apprenticeship to take account of that. So it's really, really important to make sure as providers that you are having a solid, thorough conversation with the apprentice and the employer before the apprentice starts, and that you are ensuring you know everything the apprentice has recently done in terms of qualifications or learning, what their job entails and how much of it might contribute to the content of the apprenticeship, and that you are reducing the apprenticeship time as part of that, and therefore you're also reducing the content and the price that you are charging the employer. Now, the reason that this prior learning is coming up the agenda in terms of importance for audit for the Education and Skills Funding Agency is that the Department for Education and Skills do not feel at the moment that employers are getting full value for money and use of the levy, because in quite a lot of cases they think apprentices are relearning skills and knowledge that they already had from previous either jobs or from previous qualifications or learning that they've taken. So when accounting for prior learning, you need to reduce the duration. Now, if this means that the apprenticeship then becomes less than 12 months and fails to meet the 20% off the job, that apprenticeship then becomes ineligible for funding. So you would not be able to go ahead with it, and the apprentice would not be able to take that particular apprenticeship. So as I said in the next point, prior learning includes any work experience, previous apprenticeships or prior education qualifications. So if you've got an apprentice who's quite young and they've been in learning in the last 10 years, the Learner Record Service, the LRS, is an application that you can go and look at which previous qualifications that apprentice has taken in the last 10 years that are logged that might contribute to this particular apprenticeship. But any prior learning that you do find and discover during that conversation, that thorough conversation you have with your apprentice and your employer before the apprentice starts, you must quantify that and provide evidence of it, because obviously the ESFA will still expect you to deliver the 20% off the job. But if you're delivering the apprenticeship during a shortened duration, you will need evidence to show that as well. But they will also be checking prior learning as part of their audits, and you need to include all of that in the evidence pack that you keep per individual apprentice. They are going to be auditing this quite thoroughly later on this year, so you do need to be very sure that you are not repeating learning. There are some interesting pitfalls and possibilities with this, and I've asked quite a few questions of the ESFA, which we hope that they're going to answer. And we'll be running a specialist prior learning webinar towards the end of March, early April in actual fact. So if anybody's more interested in finding out quite a bit more about prior learning, do look out for that prior learning webinar, which will be running in the first 2 weeks of April. We'll be doing a specialist webinar just about this once we've got some answers from the ESFA about where some of the quirks and the pitfalls might be with this particular new specialist audit that the ESFA are looking to carry out. That's all there is from me for the moment, so I'm going to pass you across to our colleague John Lanham. John, do you want to pick up from there?
Yeah, okay, thanks, Bryony. Okay, so just to introduce myself, good morning, everybody. I've recently left UE. I was there for 30 years, then moved on at the end of December. The last role I had at the university was leading them into the world of apprenticeships. Also in the time I was at UE, I was a UVAC board member, and we've got a slide towards the end for those of you at universities just talking around what the support that UVAC can provide. So just to set a little bit of context, UE, one of the earlier movers into apprenticeships, typical 92 university. It was a small step for us. It was a logical development of the work we did. We launched our first programs in September 17, and then further programs in 18, in the start of 18 a year ago. And some obvious areas, as I'm sure many of you are also involved in, health, nursing, so forth, and things like that. as Bryony's been running through, 20% is complex set of issues, a lot of fine detail, a lot of rules, regulations and bits and pieces that have to be controlled and managed and reported, but a key part of the apprenticeship experience. A colleague in one of the faculties, we recognise we need to have a recording system. A colleague in one of the faculties set up a PebblePad platform. I think PebblePad is a system a number of you may be familiar with. We at the university use it for students to record portfolios, to encourage them to archive and collect information about their learning. It's a very small step to include that and adapt that for apprenticeships. All seems to be going well. We did an audit last summer. Wasn't quite as positive as we'd hoped it would be. There was some evidence of some good work, but it didn't seem to be recording. The recording was patchy, and sort of raised a number of issues with me then as the lead overall about, does it mean that it wasn't being recorded, or what were the problems? So that really sort of sets the context for some thoughts I want to share with you now around how we communicate, how we put these things forward, how, as particularly at the university level, you know, we've got a fresh set of opportunities around degree apprenticeships. We've got a different type of learner. Are there different ways we can embed the 20%, different sorts of activities and so forth? So I began looking around at what we were doing across the institution. This is an extract from some information we give to the apprentices about off-the-job learning. Pretty dense, not particularly inspiring, not particularly readable. Basically a straight cut and paste from the ESFA. So I suppose at one level, were we really getting across to them what we were trying to achieve? Because if we look at the different range of options and different ways in which 20% can be recorded in different types of activities, we can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so 3 little pictures, three different industries: hard hats, construction, electronics, leadership management, business, or whatever it is. We could all call those shadowing, but they'd all do quite different activities. So we realised that there was some work we needed to do with staff around helping them understand, think a little bit laterally about what are the different types of activities. There's a danger that people feel that, irrespective of the discipline or the subject, we're chatting around this, that people will say, oh well, the 20% is the leadership management stuff. That's straightforward to do within a business context. But sort of gently challenging people to think about different types of activities. And as Bryony said, you know, 20% off the job, yes, it's classes and lectures, but there's a whole raft of other activities. And I think as we move into degree level, where we've got people working at a different level than maybe other apprentices in the past, there are different roles, different activities, different ways of thinking that we need to get the apprentices engaged with. And also, it's trying to move away from, I tried to have some discussion start trying to move away from the mindset that 20% is this thing we have to do to keep the ESFA happy, the regular, to actually it's an integral part of the apprenticeship learning. And actually, we can turn this on. And as Bryony said earlier, the standards are 2 pages. And they're actually quite broad in terms of the implementation. There's a lot of flexibility. So there's a lot of scope for us as providers to be innovative. And I know there's a lot of attention, and we have to make sure that the innovation we put together meets the rules and regulations as Bryony's run through. But I think there's huge opportunities to actually move forward and look at some different ways of thinking about this and different opportunities. And particularly at graduate, and certainly level 7, it's about embedding the work practices, because the evidence in the 20%, yes, you need to do it for the apprenticeship, but if you want to go on to be a chartered engineer, chartered accountant, or whatever, you will have to begin to collect evidence. It's that standard thing. You ask any senior manager or whatever as they're there, they will have their day book with them, their logbook. They run. Yeah, none of us leave home without a diary or something where we record what we're doing, all the information. So it's part of that type of culture rather than just this thing we have to do in order to jump through the ESFA hurdles. So started talking with some staff around that, and then also started thinking about different ways of communicating the ideas. So some different thoughts. So if we can look at the next slide. again, there's a number of different ones. It's just the number of different points. So if you just click through there, it's just different ways. If you compare that to the previous, one of the earlier slides I put up, where we've just taken some information from the ESFA regulations and given that to the apprentice, this is what you have to do. Okay, but actually it's that here, you know, and again, I end up with Einstein in the middle there. The only source of knowledge is experience. That's that real point where the learning and using of that knowledge is the real point. And you know, one of the things we say about apprenticeships is that ability to learn in a classroom, in a mentoring situation, whatever it may be, and then very quickly apply that to the work experience. So I think there's a challenge for us as providers about how we get the message across about what the 20% is around to the apprentice, to the employer, and then to academics. Sorry, moving on to the new engineer.
Sorry, John.
Sorry, it's all right. For everybody, we're working remotely. So, a couple of years ago, I picked up on a book triggered by some conversation with some colleagues at UE, Whole New Engineer. I am an engineer by training. And it tells the story of a college you may or may not have heard of in the States. They call it a college, university, Orme. And it's an engineering university, and the whole principle, the whole philosophy of the institute is built around problem-based learning, project-based learning. Now, not completely new. A number of us have used that in many different areas, etc. But I'm really struck by a number of the ideas in this book. They summarize it here, and there's a picture of the book. You can go and find it on Amazon. It's well worth reading, and there are a number of places that are taking ideas not just into engineering, but they've got sort of 10 key principles, and they're listed here, and I've highlighted a number in red because these are the ones I think that at degree level and higher levels with apprenticeships we can begin to change the way in which we approach the 20% off the job. So particularly point 5, trust the students before they trust themselves. We need to turn this around from looking at viewing the 20% as this chore, this thing you have to do and we'll wrap your knuckles if you don't, to actually it's an integral part of the learning activity. Again, instill the habits. So how do we teach them? How do we guide them? How do we put the scaffolding in there? How do we promote cultural change through shifts and so forth, etc. And then practice in thought and action, and then bring them together. So it's that team effort. So having read that, I developed some training material that I used within the university, which looked at a number of points. Moving on from that, so we can look at the next slide. Okay. So yes, as Bryony's rightly said, the 20% needs to be recorded and evaluated. It needs to be measurable. It needs to be attainable. Relevance. We need to. Key thing, as I say, I think a key shift I recognise we needed to work on is how we change that from this is something you have to do to something this is you want to do, and it's actually for your benefit. And actually, if there's 3 or 4 of you working in a company together, why not get together, work with each other, that mentoring, that supported, and timely establish patterns of behaviour. We all, in the modern world, we all live our life by Outlook or something equivalent, depending on which platform you run on. So just drop a slot into your diary on a weekly, fortnightly basis where you and the 3 other apprentices in your company get together and think about. So a number of ideas and thoughts I was pushing through to then try and encourage people, and say the little cartoon on the side there, trying to get sticking carrot. How do we change people into a whole new way of thinking? Oops, we've jumped through a couple there. Okay. I think there was another one, Brian, back. Okay, so a couple of things we chatted around with the timing and so forth was around getting groups to work together. Exploiting cohort behaviour. It's not appropriate to necessarily have one apprentice pitching against another, but was there some mileage in getting the cohorts to work together? So offer some incentives for a cohort to get all of their cohort to make sure the 20% was recorded, was up to date, and things of that nature. So run a number of training courses with colleagues, recognising that there are issues around the way in which academics need to think. So I think we as providers, as educators, need to rethink some of our ideas and some of our thoughts. And say, when I looked across the degree apprenticeships that the university was offering in the autumn, ahead of preparing this for another event, there are an awful lot of the 20% activities, reflection, evaluation, and so forth. I could, if I like devil's advocate, say stuck in a bit of a rut. As I said, how education got stuck, that we tend to just think, okay, we'll do the leadership management stuff, there's a bit of project management, whatever. That's fine, but what are the real opportunities to be innovative and creative? As Bryony said, the amount of information, or the number of activities that can be used for 20% are actually quite broad and can encompass a number of in-company training activities. But how do we move the boundaries out? And I think it does challenge, and I know certain colleagues in the university I was at were, it's that accepting and recognising that learning, technical learning, high-level technical learning, doesn't only have to take place in a lecture theatre. It can take place in the workplace, in the company. A number of the companies the university work with, a significant number of senior, experienced, chartered engineers, they're quite capable of sitting down and running over some technical content with the apprentices as much as the lecturers and so forth. So I think there's also taking a fresh look about getting away from that divide about what gets taught by the provider and what gets learnt in the company, and how we meld those together. And challenging people to be innovative and inventive with on-the-job training. And again, we ran through, and there's some different examples we saw at the university I was at, and I know there are others who've done equally innovative and creative activities. There's a lot of good work that Yuri was doing was around some of the nursing qualifications, where there is already a high level of ongoing professional development. Therefore, it's a small step to actually wrap that into the apprenticeship, and technical learning around equipment, about processes, about treatments and those sorts of things for the technicians and others working in the science lab. So I think that's the challenge we have, is that there's a danger that we focus rightly, as Bryony's run through, on the regulatory and the rules bit, but the two-page nature of the apprenticeship standard does give us as providers tremendous flexibility to think through some different ideas and some different ways of engaging. And really, that's the questions putting out there to people. It'd be interesting to have a bit of discussion back and forth with people about, okay, what are the sorts of areas where people could see they could be innovative, and what are the challenges? There's a danger as a provider that we tend to think, I want to keep everybody the same because that's simple and easy for me to mark, to assess, to monitor and control. But how, if I've got a dozen different apprentices in 8 different businesses, how do I have some flexibility around that? And okay, there may be some challenges around assessment, but that's not a reason not to try these things. So, and again, it's looking at issues around design of activities. And one example, I know that the university I was working for, have taken on board around the level 7 senior leader, is actually some quite flexible approaches to the assignments and the assessment activity that involves students pairing up and going and looking at each other's businesses. They're often coming from different sectors, from different areas, and yet they could still deliver to the academic for assessment an essay, an evaluation that's relatively straightforward to mark and assess. So just because people are in different businesses, different employers, shouldn't preclude us from actually allowing some flexibility. And I think that it also does raise issues for ongoing development around staff development. How do we encourage staff? And I know it can sometimes be a challenge for academics to let go of some of the learning and accept that there are other areas where learning can take place. I need to manage that and have some oversight, but actually there is some equally valid learning that takes place. So that's really just a few thoughts from the lived experience that we had at UWE, and it's just around a sort of yes, we need to be compliant, as Bryony's identified, but how do we, moving forward, begin to come up with some creative ways that that engage the learner, that deliver the objectives of the standard, that lay down the foundations for professional life, for a way of working, and also are innovative, flexible, exciting, and so forth. Because at the end of the day, the best learning takes place when the learner, the apprentice, is driving it along, and we as academics, we as teachers, are supporting and coaching and trying to catch up with them. So I think some interesting issues and some interesting opportunities. And I think apprenticeships offer us a great opportunity to try some different ways of working. So be interested to hear from the room, so to speak, any thoughts and views on where people have done some similar examples, or they've got some examples of good practice they'd like to share. Okay, I think there's a couple more. So again, just as a side point around UVAC, University Vocational Awards Council, as it says they're a not-for-profit organisation. It's been key and instrumental in helping a number of universities get on board and get their heads around apprenticeships. As it says there, we've got about 80, 90 odd members, which cut across all of the university sectors. We put a lot of services and support up there around getting on the register, all of those other areas and activities. But as the nature of our organisations, it's not just about delivery, it's also about research, how we move things forward, and we try to capture that through the Journal of Higher Education Skills of Work-Based Learning, as the details are there. So if you're a university that isn't already a member of UVAC, we'd encourage you to shout and get in touch. Contact details for one of the team are there, and be very happy to have a conversation about how we can work with you and help demystify what is a very complex landscape, but it's one in which I think there's huge scope and opportunity for innovation and development. We can draw and learn from the experiences of the FE sector and City and Guilds and people like that, but there's huge opportunity to scope and take things forward in new areas.
Thanks very much, John. Also, just to let everybody know, City and Guilds as a group offers a number of CPD events to support our provider base, that's HEIs and FE providers with apprenticeship delivery. And you can see two of them there: preparing your apprentice for endpoint assessment. Incredibly important that EPA, if you're delivering a non-academic type apprenticeship, that your apprentice is ready for EPA. It's one of the areas that we've noted over the last 2 years since the reforms were brought in is a real challenge for a lot of providers. So we do offer CPD events for that, and also best practice in professional discussions, which is often forms part of the endpoint assessment. So details and dates for that can be found on the link you can see there, what training we offer and CPD we offer to centres. And also, if you've got any questions about that, or you want to discuss anything to do with delivery of apprenticeships for your organisation, Julie's contact details are there at the bottom. Julie's one of our leads in our HE team. And actually, Julie Rowlett and Joe Bell are going to join us for the questions section, which we're now going to take as our HEI experts for City and Guilds ILM. So we'll now take some questions, which I hope that Michelle has got up on the screen.
Yeah, we've had quite a few. But some of them may have been answered throughout the webinar, but I'll just run through them again just in case you've missed that. So, do exams count for off the job, as this is not new KSBs, even though checking learning? Even through checking learning?
Do exams count towards apprenticeships? Can you read that again? Sorry, yeah. Michelle.
Do exams count for towards off the job, as this is not new KSBs, even though checking
knowledge, skills and behaviours? No, exams do not count towards off the job. And as I said earlier on in that slide, off the job has to be new skills, new learning, new behaviours. So no, exams and that would be part, I think, of that prior learning issue that I raised later on in the slide deck. Any prior learning or any prior qualifications that and even prior work experience that would end up with the apprentice repeating knowledge or skills or competencies or behaviours that they've already established because of an exam or because of a qualification cannot count towards off the job, and in fact cannot count towards the apprenticeship at all. And that's when you'd have to think seriously about reducing the duration of apprenticeships and not repeat that learning.
How do you calculate for contracts which state 37.5 hours per week, or as many hours as is required to complete the task? This kind of contract has an expectation of some out of hours working. This being the case, the out of hours is less distinct.
Oh gosh, yes, that's one of those challenging ones that becomes really sticky, isn't it? I think it depends with out of hours working. It depends whether it happens regularly. So I think that conversation that you have with the employer at the commencement of the apprenticeship is really important. It's then that you can say to the employer, I mean, if it's really sporadic out of hours, or it just occurs as part of a project that's not what you would call specified overtime or specified out of hours working, then I don't see how you can actually incorporate that into your 20% off the job calculations, because you haven't got any real answer from the employer as to when it's going to occur. So I would say under those circumstances, even though it says there may be some out of hours learning, because the employer would say to you, well, we never know what is going to happen, because we never know when the next project is going to come in or when that overtime is going to be required, you can't really count it. I think it's only where overtime is a regular occurrence and the employer knows that it's going to occur that it becomes a real part of that off the job calculation. There are some real challenges in that. For instance, if you've got employers that have regular overtime working because of seasonal work. So I'm thinking, for instance, here like hospitality and catering. We all know that Christmas for the hospitality and catering industry is an incredibly busy period. Quite often summer is a very busy period as well if it's based in a hotel. I think at those points you would have to work with the employer to seriously think about, if they know there's going to be overtime at those periods, because it's seasonal work that occurs every single year, you'd have to work through some sort of approach with the employers taking some of that into consideration and maybe come up with an average that you could add onto your off-the-job calculations. But I think showing that evidence in the evidence pack and showing how you've calculated it is very important to make sure that you as providers are safe and your employer's safe, to show that you have taken some of that into consideration. I hope that answers the question, because I know it's not an easy one and it's not straightforward.
Is this use of APL, for example, if someone missing first level and join at level 2 of the degree apprenticeship, effectively reducing the duration to 2 years rather than 3?
I think what you're asking there is accreditation of prior learning. As long as an apprenticeship meets that 12-month minimum duration, doesn't matter about any apprenticeship. Every single apprenticeship, I mean, you could compress an apprenticeship that was 2 years long into 12 months if you thought your apprentice was going to work hard enough and fast enough and they were able to do that, and you were happy, they were happy, and the employer was happy. But the minimum duration for any apprenticeship has to be 12 months, regardless of the actual duration stated on the apprenticeship standard. So as long as you're hitting that 12 months duration and you're making sure that you can deliver and the learning is going to be filled during that 12 months, you're okay. So if you've taken accredited prior learning into consideration, and that's reduced the duration of your apprenticeship from 3 years down to 2 years as an apprenticeship, a degree apprenticeship, yes, you are safe with that. That's fine. You've just got to make sure that you are evidencing that accredited prior learning, or that you're recognising the prior learning. There's evidence of that in your evidence pack, and that both the employer and the apprentice and yourself have signed to say that in the commitment statement, so that you know you're reducing the content, you're reducing the duration, but also reducing the price, so the employer is getting value for money.
There's a point there. I know there was a surveying standard that UE are delivering, and because of the portfolio nature leading to the gateway point, I think the professional body sets a minimum, because I think you can have advanced entry, as Bryony says, but in some cases there may be other factors where the industry is saying that's fine. In theory, yes, from an ESFA point of view, you could join in within the last year, etc., etc. But from a professional body, they're saying in order to achieve the breadth and the nature of the portfolio that's needed as part of the gateway in the EPA, you would have insufficient time. So depending on the area, you probably also want to check the specifics of the sector to make sure there weren't other factors that might set a slightly longer duration for someone transferring in.
Good point, John. Thank you.
Okay, next question. Is there a specified minimum of face-to-face training element to the off-the-job element? What % can be online? So would one-to-one mentoring and teaching sessions delivered via Skype or WebEx, for example, count as online as well?
No, that doesn't count as online, because online learning is basically when the apprentice is doing something themselves on a computer with no contact with the tutor, and they've just been given content they've got to learn. But if you're having, there's nothing wrong whatsoever with Skype learning, as in you might be having a one-to-one with the learner on Skype, or you might be taking them through some learning content on Skype. You can count that pretty much as face-to-face. It's just you're not in the same classroom. But I mean, in this day and age of technology, if that's not counted as off the job, I don't know what would be. So no, you'll find that it's obviously evidencing it. How do you evidence that? You'd have to get your apprentice to log it in some way and log it as Skype face-to-face learning. But no, you're fine with that. That does count. There's no percentage given in the rules for the blended learning approach. I think it's really down to a decision between yourself, the apprentice, and the employer as to what best meets the learning aims of that particular apprenticeship. No apprenticeship, because obviously apprenticeship does intrinsically mean that you are doing on and off the job learning. No apprenticeship can be learned solely in the classroom and solely on a computer. There's got to be a content of on the job learning and off the job learning, because that's what an apprenticeship is. So, but each apprenticeship is going to be somewhat different. Some might require a lot more time in the classroom because there's a lot of theory to learn and a lot less time doing off the job. And some may require more on the job learning because obviously there's a lot of practical learning to occur. Some of that which will be off the job. So it will vary per apprenticeship. But the ESFA and DFE are saying that you can't do an entire apprenticeship online, which I think we would all know if we're thinking about an apprenticeship from a quality learning approach for the individual. John, do you want to add anything to that at all?
No, I think no. As you say, I mean, I think it's that point that we've got to get beyond just seeing the 20% as this box we have to tick. It's an integral part of the way in which the apprenticeship brings delivers the learning outcome. But as you say, it's inevitable, that integration. So no, nothing further to add.
Next one's a question that's been asked quite a few times. So, if the apprentice gets more than 28 days statutory leave, do they build that into the calculator, or do you just stick to the 28 days of the calculation?
No, you stick to the 28 days. It's the national statutory holiday leave which is now calculated. As far as the ESFA and DFE were concerned, they needed to make it fair, and they needed to make it equitable across the entire apprenticeship landscape. So they decided that it should be the national holiday entitlement that is deducted, regardless of what some people get. And if you think about it, there are some teachers that get a lot of holidays per year. If you deducted all the holidays that they are factually given as part of their job role, it would make off-the-job delivery for, say, a teacher a lot more difficult to manage because they have a shorter period. You'd also deliver a lot less off the job, where in actual fact they probably need more. And there are some jobs where they do get 6 or 8 weeks holiday a year, and then there are some jobs where they only get 20. So as far as the ESFA and DF are concerned, no, it's the national statutory entitlement to deduct to keep it fair and equitable across the board.
You said that after the job needed to be completed before the gateway.
Yes.
Is the calculation made for the full duration of the apprenticeship, or just the duration up to gateway?
It's just the duration up to gateway. And it says in the ESFA funding rules that the duration of the apprenticeship must be a minimum of 12 months plus whatever time is needed for endpoint assessment. In the case of HEIs, you're probably delivering something that's a lot more than 12 months, although that obviously may vary. But the minimum duration of any apprenticeship is 12 months plus time for gateway. So if you were delivering a 12-month apprenticeship, you would have to have the 365 days or the 52 weeks, plus however much time you would need to actually project plan in the endpoint assessment for your apprentice, whether that was 1, 2, 3 weeks, depending on when you booked it with your endpoint assessment organisation. I hope that's clear.
Not sure if you've covered this, but if an employer gives an apprentice a day during contracted working hours to revise for an exam, does this count towards the 20% of the job?
No, because they're revising content they've already learned. There There are some flexibilities in this, and it's, as John was saying earlier, it's not straightforward, and it is really about planning it in such a way that it's best practice for the individual and for the employer. But I know that during some revision, there have been times when apprentices have learnt new information. For example, City and Guilds offers an endpoint assessment support tool as part of the endpoint assessment when providers book with us, and when they book their endpoint assessment, they get access to that endpoint assessment support tool, which has modules in it to support the apprentice with their endpoint assessment. For example, there are modules which cover how to do a really good presentation, how to have a really good professional discussion. If that is new learning that the apprentice has access to before they take endpoint assessment, because they've not covered it in their apprenticeship, but actually the content of this standard indicates that that is learning that they should access, and knowledge and skills they should develop, then yes. And some people count that as revision, but realistically my view of revision is you're going over content that you already know. And if that's what's occurring, then it's not new learning, it's not new skills, so it cannot count towards off the job. So it very much depends what you include in revision, or what the apprentice is including in revision, as to whether it can count towards off the job. So think about whether it's new or whether it's actually going over old content that they've already learned. If it's old content, it's a no. If it's something new that they're revising in preparation for endpoint assessment, then potentially, if it's in the standard and you can map it, it could count.
How much of the skills standards can be evidenced through academic assessment? Would it be preferable to have witness statements to evidence skills?
John, I pass that one to you.
The line broke up in the middle. Could you just repeat the question?
Of course. How much of the skills standards can be evidenced through academic assessment? Would it be preferable to have witness statements to evidence skills?
I think as you move up at degree level, it's about evidence. Yeah. So I'm just trying to think. I mean, obviously, if you were thinking like a digital tech, computer, etc., the skill would be around writing code or something like that. Then you've got a piece of code, you've got and then an evaluation and a report that could be written around that. So I think linking practical work, evidence of skills demonstration, and then a reflective evaluation of that activity is something that is relatively straightforward, that you could expect the apprentice to do. And I've set many, I think of assignment briefs I've set, they are doing that. Now, you could, as part of that, require the apprentice to get an evaluation, a peer evaluation or something like that of, so for example, taking a digital tech type apprenticeship, someone's written a piece of code or built a web page or something like that, etc. They have to submit to the academic a report and evaluation, evidence of the learning gained, etc., and reflective about. But you could also, as part of the assignment activity, require them to get 3 users within the company to test and and explore and evaluate what they'd written and produced as evidence of other users, etc. So I think those sorts of activities could quite readily be written into an evaluation.
I'm just going to do one more. We have got lots more questions, but I think we'll have to do just a frequently asked questions document, because we're not going to have time to get through them all. So last question, what happens if the apprentice does not meet the 20% off the job training? Are they stopped from progressing to the EPA?
Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, they're not stopped from progressing to EPA, but what's going to happen is at some point you're going to receive an audit, and the Education and Skills Funding Agency is potentially going to claw back funding from you. But also, I mean, you'd have to, the reality is they can't really meet Gateway unless they've achieved their 20% off the job, unless they've achieved all the learning to enable them to be successful. So I think the big question there is more about, if they haven't done the 20% of the job, why have they not achieved it? Have they learned all the knowledge, skills, behaviours and competencies to make sure that they can actually effectively achieve their apprenticeship and effectively achieve endpoint assessment, or whatever assessment it is you're doing as part of the degree apprenticeship? and if they haven't achieved 20% off the job, does that really mean that they are going to be fully effective and they are going to be fully conversant? So go on, John.
I'd also hope if your interim review meetings have been working effectively, you'd have been tracking that earlier to discover right at the end that the 20%, one of the key bits, hasn't been happening, is a little bit late. And I think, yeah, there are some fundamental gaps between the relationship between the company, the provider, and so forth. So I'd hope, to an extent, you should be never getting to that point because you should have tracked it earlier.
So that slide what we mentioned earlier about best practice and endpoint, best practice in 20% off the job and logging and tracking and evidencing, those reviews that you carry out with your apprentice, it's at that point that you'll be looking at the time that you'd already had in terms of percentage of off the job, and making sure there was still enough time within the apprenticeship duration to complete the remaining off the job that's required. And if there's not, you'd have to work through with the apprentice and the employer some way of actually making sure that you included more off the job before they reach gateway, because it is important that they get that minimum 20%. One, to make sure they're completely conversant and fully qualified as far as completing their apprenticeship is concerned, but also from a best practice point of view for you as a provider. So yes, think about that best practice approach that John and I mentioned, and also the evidencing slide that we showed earlier about when you should be checking and monitoring that.
Okay, great. Well, that's unfortunately all we've got time for. As I say, we have got a lot more questions that we haven't been able to get through. But we will put them onto an FAQ and get that sent out with the copy of the slides and a copy of the recording of this webinar. But I just want to say thanks to Ronnie and thanks to John. And please do take a few moments just to complete the feedback survey. But other than that, thank you very much for your time. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Thanks, John.
Thanks for dialing in.